Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co host, Nathan Rittenhouse. This episode is for those of you who want to be on the know about what crypto-religiosity is, or what does it mean to be crypto-religious. This comes out of a book that Cameron is reading, and it gets complex and nuanced in all sorts of ways. And in fact, we run out of time in this conversation. So this is part one of an introduction to what it means to be crypto-religious and whether or not it's a real thing or even valuable. As always, if you like what we're doing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support the work that we're doing, you can do so by visiting www.toltogether.com.
So I've been thinking about the term or the phrase crypto-religious lately, Nathan. And I think this one's about to enter into the popular lexicon a little bit
All
more.
right,
I could be wrong.
listen up, everybody. You're about to get
Yes.
a head start.
Well, so perceptive listeners will recognize perhaps the source of that quote, and it is the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. I've heard people say Miłosz before too. I mean, there's an L in there. I'm going to say Miłosz, but
Let's go
so
with
Polish
99% of the
poet.
people listening to this haven't heard it either way. So start fresh.
You know what? You're right. That's always the good wet blanket comment from Nathan there. It's probably
Well,
true.
I mean, it's like Cameron's like, well, as the famous philosopher, you're like, yeah, nobody's ever heard of it. So anyway,
Famous. Let's qualify that. So, but some of you will know Czesław Miłosz. Perhaps he's most famous not as a poet, but for his book, The Captive Mind, on what it was like to live day in and day out in a communist nation where truth was carefully policed, or
Mm.
truth in quotes, in scare quotes. It's a really great book. But his main vocation was as a poet at the time. So he lived outside. He lived in exile for a long time. Settled at the University of California, Berkeley for a while. Was a very successful poet there at the time. Even had a private meeting with Pope John Paul II. And those of you who remember, John Paul II was himself Polish. The Catholic Church is very important in the nation of Poland. This is, it had its communist years, but of all of the European nations, Poland is perhaps one of the most fiercely Catholic, actually. So a very important, significant meeting. But it's Czesław Miłosz who coins the term crypto-religious, and he does it in exchange with Thomas Merton, author of the Trappist monk, probably one of the most famous Trappist monks of all time. And he really is famous. The Seven-Story Mountain was a massive bestseller that he wrote. But so Thomas Merton was very explicitly religious as a devout Catholic and a monk. And he was pressing on Miłosz on what do you actually believe? Are you or aren't you? And the Pope, John Paul II, did this too. And Miłosz refused to take a firm stance and said, I have to be crypto-religious, because if I was explicit with my religious convictions, they would be co-opted politically and they would be used against me. Some people will hear that as just kind of lame excuses. Some people will be thinking of figures right now who are doing much the same thing. Public intellectuals, Jordan Peterson, does that rhymes with?
right.
But anyway, but we have the term crypto-religious. So there's a book that's come out by Paul Elie, and it's called The Last Supper, and I think it's a very good book. I not quite finished with it, about halfway through it, so I'm going to sort of reserve my critical judgments for it for when I finish the book. He is the author of another book also called The Life You Save May Be Your Own. That was a spiritual biography of 4 Catholic writers, and it's a marvelous book. Some of you have probably read it, but the 4 authors he's looking at in that book are Walker Percy, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Catholic journalist, and Flannery O'Connor, the youngest of those 4. But people had asked him for years, "Are you going to do a follow-up? I mean, what's the follow-up book about, spiritual, other spiritual artists?" And he says this one's his answer, and it's not going to be the answer people were looking for, though, because the figures he looks at in this book are what he calls crypto-religious. And I'll define that as he defines it here in a second, because he has actually a fairly technical way of defining it, and he's pretty careful with how he uses that. But the figures in there, he's looking at people in the decade of the 80s. He sees the 80s as a very artistically rich and interesting period. He also happened to live through it himself. That he was a student at that time. and he said it was a very exciting time to be a young person. But so the artists he chronicles in The Last Supper are people widely disparate. I mean, this is gonna so people like Prince, Madonna, yeah, Madonna, Bono. I think you two will make more
From
sense to
Merton to
people. You
Madonna.
two,
My.
from Merton to Andy Warhol. You know, a lot of people don't know this. Andy Warhol had a very devout Catholic upbringing, but remained. I don't. He's it's you can't call Andy Warhol devout in the traditional sense, but he went to church his entire life. He attended mass in his entire life. He made a vow to do it, and he did. He was more spiritually serious than people realized. But it's figures like this. So let's talk about, and then I'll kick it over to Nathan here for a second. But what he means by crypto religious, and he is taking it from Czesław Miłosz. He means an artist that uses explicit religious imagery, metaphors, motifs, tropes, but the status of their actual belief remains ambiguous. And because you ask yourself the question, well, do they actually believe? They bring a dynamic that forces you, the audience, to wrestle with your own faith and ask yourself, but do I believe? And he believes this is really important, especially for the 1980s, is because as we enter into a post-secular world where Christianity is always contested, it's one option among many options, it's not really possible to be as forthright. I mean, you can be of course it is. I mean, you can be forthright, but you're not going to be heard in the same way if you're really forthright and just explicit with your beliefs. These artists are, in order to remain powerful and prophetic, have to be cryptic. He's, Paul Elie is arguing. Another figure here, we've talked about him before, and I think it's worth bringing him in, is Bob Dylan, Nathan. Bob Dylan is one of the easiest to point to in terms of, a lot of people, does he really believe? Because Bob Dylan just seems to, he has this really uncanny ability to anticipate the next big wave of what's going to capture people's imaginations and to latch onto it and really dig in, burrow into the roots of it. So it's even, and this is how Paul Elie represents him when he begins his so-called Christian moment. It's the album Slow Train Coming. I think that came out in 1979. And even the picture of the slow train coming is, Paul Elie sees that as Bob Dylan anticipating there's going to be this big wave where Christianity is suddenly very, very important and it's in the public eye. It has real political force, and it's gonna. And he anticipated that. He caught it. He makes this, and this record is one of the first hits he has in a long, long time. It's really big. It's a really big moment. But then, as the years wear on, and Bob Dylan begins to change and release more spiritually ambiguous material, and now and certainly in his lifestyle doesn't seem like he's certainly not an evangelical Christian. That question remains. I mean, so it's very important for Paul Elie that the artist in question, their status, their own belief remains ambiguous. So I thought this was really interesting. I thought it'd be worth talking about two questions, Nathan. Whether crypto religiosity is possible in our moment, which is so politically polarized and charged, and if so, who are some of the artists who might fit into this category?
Okay.
You don't have to answer both of those right now, but yeah, that's where I'm gonna kind of
I can give short answers to
point
both
us
of
for the
these.
time
Yeah,
being.
no. All right, so let's go some definitions. I think if you're like me and you hear the word crypto, you're thinking cryptocurrency. So the word crypto itself has become shorthand for cryptocurrency, and it's a very biblical word. It just means hidden or secret. I know. So your
Mhm.
father who sees what is done in cryptos, will reward you. So the idea of a secretness or a hiddenness, some kind of inaccessible, inaccessibility. Yeah. So cryptos is very much there, usually translated secret in the New Testament. So a cryptocurrency would have some kind of hiddenness. The blockchain, you can't trace it back. That's why it's hip. It's why it's crypto. It's
Mhm.
cryptic, I guess is the way we would say that. Um, so secret religion is not really um, a powerful biblical concept. There are times in which I think Jesus is cryptic in himself about what he is doing, but he's never really cryptic. I'm trying to debate in your mind as I'm saying this. So, like, what are the biblical precedents? Because there's a whole lot more of like, hey, you're either with me or against me. There's a little more
Hmm.
twofold here, and my hunch would be that, and my personal sentiment, not having read the book, so you'll have to push back here, is that I think artists themselves, it's hard for me to say, oh, there's like some kind of, is he saying there's a strategic crypticness to what they're doing, or is it just an ambiguity in their own minds about what they actually believe? Because I interpret
No, that's a
artists
really good
that
question.
way more. Like,
Hmm.
even Yeats talked about writing good poetry that he himself wasn't exactly sure what it meant, or that a poet can do that.
Hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
or there's a sense in which the culture that we, I remember one time being at a debate where Michael Shermer, who's, professional skeptic, and he said, he polled the audience on something about like, what percentage do you believe that Jesus, that there's an afterlife, and like half the audience raised their hands, and he goes, Jesus Christ. And of course everybody cracked up laughing, because like, why would you?
Yeah.
So Michael Shermer is not a Christian. He's just using Jesus Christ as a culturally known
Yes.
responsive phrase to a, so there's a way in which the language that he is using, I think you do see this even in your Jonathan Haidts and your Jordan Petersons and so forth, who are not explicitly religious but just find religious language to pack the
Yep.
most. Even your Peter
Hmm.
Thiels these days, who are talking about big
Yep.
technological things and theological, that it's not really it's not that they have a belief that is defined to themselves and then they're hiding it from the public in order to do some sort of Trojan horse in order to secret this knowledge into the halls of power, as much as this language just works best for them, and they're using it while
Hmm.
they're scrambling to describe reality as they see it. So I think that'd be a good starting
Hmm.
point to clarify here.
It's great.
Which
It's really
which
helpful.
which one is he using?
So he actually has been asked questions along these lines as well in their interviews, and Paul Elie is just obviously I'm a fan of the guy. So he's on top of being a phenomenal writer, very humble in interviews and very down to earth, but clearly just one of these blazingly brilliant people. It just comes across. Certain people just give off that aura.
They're
Everybody
connecting the
uses that
dots
word.
rather rapidly.
They are, and he does that. Well, there's also just there's an incredible depth, but he's very careful. He weighs what he says very carefully, and you can feel that in every interview. So when when we talk about, first of all, it's important to recognize that he is talking about artists, not public intellectuals, artists. And it's
Mhm.
very important. That's one of the interesting features of this book. He is doing something different from books that usually examine a decade. Usually if you're looking at, let's say it's a book on the 1960s, well, you can bet that a good deal of it is going to be devoted to politics and, sociological factors, the economy, things like that. Those are important factors, but that's not what his book is doing. He's looking through an artistic lens. So all of his examples of crypto religion are artists. And so that's important to recognize as well.
But I think that's what confuses it, is because artists are given the most flexibility culturally in not needing to land on anything, but more articulate a mood.
Mhm. Yes, and one question that's asked that I think is directly related to what you said, Nathan, is is there such a thing as non-crypto religious art? Can you have lasting art that doesn't have some spiritual dimension? It won't last, probably, presumably it won't last if it doesn't have some spiritual dimension in it. And his answer to that, I thought that was a good question. His answer to it surprised me. He said, absolutely, without hesitation, absolutely, yes, there is. He said there's a lot of modernist art that clearly has no, he gives, so I'll give you a few examples that he gives because they're good, but that has no real spiritual dimension in it, in the sense that there's no question where the author stands
The
on the matter.
Macarena.
One There you go, the Macarena, yes. Well, I mean, there is the question, of course, of whether that actually is art or not. I'm just joking. But the example he gives is Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. And even so, the title itself is making use of biblical imagery, interestingly enough. But the reason he gives that as an example is he says when you read The Handmaid's Tale, there is no question in your mind that Margaret Atwood has a very negative view of Christianity. You know where the author of this story stands. In order for something to qualify as crypto-religious, that has to remain ambiguous. And so and now, as to the question of whether that can carry some real prophetic force, that's a really important question too. Let me answer it cryptically myself.
Well, hang on a
And
sec
then you can
before we
push
move
back.
on, because
Y
that
yeah, go ahead.
The Handmaid's Tale is not as anti-religious as Margaret Atwood herself is. It's strange. I mean, a religious faction is what saves the day at the end of The Handmaid's Tale. So it does. I don't know. That's a
Yeah,
confusing example to me a
but
little bit.
well, no, the example is used because he says that it's clear that the author does not is it, the author is atheistic, and that comes through pretty loud and clear in the tone of the book. I think it does too. I would agree with him on that.
Okay.
So she's that's why his definition is a little bit more nuanced than it may initially seem. And I also worry about crypto religious entering into the popular lexicon because it's going to lose some of this nuance because his definition really hinges on that necessary ambiguity. So that would also exclude artists who are making cynical use of Christian tropes and imagery just to either to mock or to try to just get some poetic leverage from it without
Okay.
really.
But back to my question: is he saying that this is intentionally done, or that the artist themselves is just confused about what they actually believe?
He is saying that this. I think well, if I'm not
Because
misreading him.
let's jump ahead to like a modern, like, what do they
Hmm.
call it, like crossover music? Like, is this person singing about
Hmm.
Jesus or their boyfriend? Like,
Right.
it seems
Yep.
like it's strategically written in a way that it's made to play
Hmm.
well to two audiences, and that's
Yes.
not, and that's just like a marketing choice probably more than a statement about the
Yes.
belief of the musician.
Hmm. So he is arguing, if I'm understanding him correctly, that this is an intentional choice. And again, the people he's choosing, he recognizes he takes them seriously as artists.
Okay.
So that means he doesn't think they're just mere commercial artists. So that's why the book is what I love about this book is how surprising it is. I would expect Bob Dylan, yeah. Leonard Cohen, absolutely. That fits. Leonard Cohen is a profound poet. So is Bob Dylan. They're amazing songwriters. They're recognized as serious art. Their
Okay,
music is
but
taught in college courses, but
help me.
not, hold on, but not Madonna. People
Right.
I haven't heard Madonna taken with this level of seriousness. Prince is taken seriously as because he's just an absolute first-rate musician, but he's also a very sexually and flamboyant and explicit, you know, singer who pushed the boundaries and pushed the envelope. But to have them singled out as for serious artistic consideration is also really surprising and really interesting when it comes to this book. And I didn't realize that Madonna called her. So, do you know Madonna is her given name? By the way, I did not know that.
Hmm.
That was news to me. I assumed that was a clever choice on her, but it wasn't. That's her name. She was born Madonna Louise. But then, not only that, I didn't realize that in the 80s, she proclaimed herself to be a Catholic, and she was
Did the
still
Catholic
Madonna,
Church
doing all.
proclaim her to be a Catholic?
No. No, 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 no. So she
Yeah, I
was
was gonna say.
locked into an intense part of what made her so compelling at the time. See, we missed the boat on this because we weren't. I mean, I was a little
Born.
kid, right, or born, but there was an intense controversy between her and the Catholic Church because she represented a PR nightmare for them. Miss Like a Virgin talking about how she's a Catholic and advocating loudly for the distribution of condoms in the inner city. Also, a huge factor, one big sociological factor that he does deal with because it was so important in the 1980s was the AIDS epidemic and how it disproportionately affected the gay community, particularly in New York City. And so many of these artists, Madonna included, were working in New York, had close friends who were dying and died of AIDS, and the Catholic churches. I mean, you have to. This was something that just, it's easy to look back, and hindsight is 2020. But at the time, there was a mix of panic, fear, and people were just trying to wrap their heads around what was happening in the first place. And then, of course, Catholic bishops are expected to have a stance on this and have a clear response, and some of them weren't so merciful in that response. But all of these artists, Andy Warhol had so many friends who died of AIDS. So that was a part of all of that was going on here as well. I'll pause there.
Yeah, but so I'm still not convinced. I know we're only halfway through this, so I'm gonna make you keep working.
Well, what are you
here.
not what are you not convinced by?
I'm not. So Leonard
Or
Cohen's
what are you,
song.
what are you not
Yeah.
convinced of? Yeah.
So Leonard Cohen's song "Hallelujah" played
Right.
everywhere ad
Prime
nauseum.
example.
Prime
Yep.
example where he
Yep.
himself, I think, has said he doesn't ascribe a particular meaning. Like, if you have you ever listened to the words of that?
Mhm.
You're like, "What in the world
Oh,
is
yeah.
like, okay,
Well, they're also very sexually charged. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah." So but he himself doesn't claim that he's making a point or know what it means, just kind of a spontaneous,
Well, he he's got another one called Song of Isaac, from the perspective of Isaac, who's going to be sacrificed by his dad. That he's made clear that that was really about the Vietnam War
okay. So
as well,
there's
and so he's using heavy. Yep.
so Paul's argument is that these people are actually true believers, and they're
No,
n o
no.
okay, I
Yeah,
think
so
that's maybe
it's a
that's a more pointed way of asking what
no.
I'm saying here.
That's a great, yeah, thanks for asking it pointedly. No, his argument is that they are crypto-religious precisely because you can't pin them down explicitly. You don't know. His argument is that they clearly, but that for them, religion is something very serious. So Leonard Cohen, if we take him as an example, spent years in, I mean, everywhere from Buddhist monasteries, and went to and then made pilgrimages to Israel. I mean, clearly lived as a kind of weary pilgrim seeking out new spiritual experiences. Yes, now he was also a total womanizer. He was also an absolute hedonist. So Paul Elie is himself, by the way, he doesn't draw explicit attention to this, but Paul Elie is himself, by the way, a Catholic. So he he's not arguing that these people were Christians, or that he's not even arguing that they necessarily believed he in fact, I think Paul Elie might say some of them maybe believe, some of them maybe don't really know where they fall. But what they are doing is they have found in religion a very real resonance, and they recognize that resonance as real and powerful and vital. But they don't necessarily land on an explicit set of convictions.
Let me give you
Yeah.
let me throw this story in here, and you see if this parallels a bit of the argument, or maybe this clarifies the angle that I'm
Mhm.
coming to it. Let's take the book of Ecclesiastes. People quote
Mhm.
bits and pieces out of the book of Ecclesiastes, and there's some of them are proverbial in a sense. But I think when I was pretty young, that my grandpa pointed out to me, he's like, the book of Ecclesiastes are not like a list of to-dos. It's a record of the thoughts that are passing through a man's mind as he's trying to make sense of reality. And then,
Yeah.
you get to the conclusion at the end, and he's like, and here's the summary of it all. But that doesn't mean that you go back through, like, he's just thinking out loud and reflecting on his experience and saying, I've done, so that doesn't mean that I go and try to do all the things that are in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's just a an artistic or poetic rendering of an attempt at making sense of life. And it feels
Mhm.
more to me like that would be what I would see in these, the term that he's using, crypto religious, is that they're grappling with something that maybe they themselves
Mhm.
have not fully comprehended the fullness of, but there's a resonance there with their
Mhm.
experience in their art form that
Mhm.
works, even though they themselves aren't necessarily acutely aware of what that is. So for me, I kind of look at it as a um well, maybe jump ahead to the second part of what you're gonna say there is like, what's the value or what's the takeaway?
Yeah,
Where
I
does
was gonna say, you want me to tell you why I like it?
Yeah. After we finished recording this, we realized that this conversation got way longer than we intended. And so, for the sake of your sanity and our sanity, and for the sake of time, we're going to split this and release part 2 of this conversation as our next episode.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.